Thank you to Lars and Dorian for this invitation, and to the great staff at M+. So far in my day of spending time with them, it does seem like a museum unlike others I've known, at least in terms of its collegiality and ambition and expertise. So it's an honor to be here. And I do want to say that this talk in many ways is very new and somewhat raw. It comes from a desire to think both what globalization might be and also what it hides or occludes. But I'll just begin with that warning. Let me start with an axiom. It may be overly simple or even crude, but I think it may open up a way of understanding how image flows operate under conditions of globalization. As there were three worlds during the Cold War period, according to many, I believe there were correspondingly three predominant image worlds. And here I'm showing you one very simple image to stand in for each: Jackson Pollock's classic drip painting from 1950, Dong Xiwen's The Founding Ceremony of the Nation from 1951, and an anonymous kente cloth from Ghana in Africa. In this slide, the three image worlds might be categorized as follows. One, modern art, which is linked geographically to the developed first world. Two, socialist realist art, which is equally as modern, if not as modernist. And this I want to insist on, is that the socialist realist works in China and in Russia were in many ways a global modernism, just as the modernist work of Pollock represents as well. They represent a kind of realist second world modernism or globalism. And third, with the example of the kente cloth, we have an instance of what could be called indigenous art, in this case drawn from the Akan people of Ghana and the Ivory Coast. So we might conclude then that the three worlds of the Cold War roughly corresponded to three modes of image production, where a kind of image world is pegged to a geopolitical region. But the actual conditions of art production worldwide are much more complex than such a geographical stratification suggests. For in each of the zones that I've mentioned, the three worlds according to this normative story, and I understand somewhat reductive story that I'm proposing here, there were also three art worlds in each of these internal categories, in each of the so-called first, second, and third worlds. So let me just show you what I mean by that. In the United States, for instance, there was not only modernist art, of course, but also what might be called capitalist realism, which is exemplified by an artist like Norman Rockwell, known for his illustrations for very popular magazines such as this one, Look magazine. And it's probably, the slide, I'm sorry, is probably too small for you to see, but it's showing John F. Kennedy, who was already assassinated at this point in the Democratic political convention. So it's a form of popular cultural realism that was just, if not more, lively than the modernist register of images. And then finally, the lowest slide here is showing a Native American Navajo Indian making sand painting, which was very important to Jackson Pollock, as some of you may know. But the point here is to indicate that there were at least these three worlds already in the United States, in my example. So much as in much of the developed world, realist traditions persisted alongside modernist painting, as well as indigenous forms of art. Secondly, in the so-called second world, as I don't really need to tell this audience, there was also an underground, unofficial modernist art movement occurring during the post-war period that flourished as the '85 Art New Wave around that time and culminated in the landmark exhibition China Avant-Garde in 1989, which included Xiao Lu's performance of shooting her own work, which I'm showing you in the slide here, which caused the closing down of that exhibition before again opening and being closed down permanently. Finally, as again you know better than I, traditional forms of ink art persisted throughout through their own dedicated institutions of training and exhibition through much of the 20th century, though as I learned yesterday, was arrested during the Cultural Revolution period, but is a continuous indigenous practice, one of many that could include ceramics as well. So in the so-called Second World, all of these three worlds coexisted as in the first, and finally, it won't be a surprise that I will make the same point about my so-called third world or indigenous example, where here the artist El Anatsui, who is at the top, has built a global career, in part through adapting some of the formal techniques of kente cloth, the indigenous example with which I began and which is still at the bottom of this slide, to the production of striking textile-like works which are composed of discarded fragments of things like Nigerian liquor bottle caps which are pierced together with copper wire. So these are things that are discarded that have associations with alcohol use and perhaps abuse, but are made into a kind of beautiful fabric on a very large scale to make these lush, gorgeous artworks which have circulated widely within the global art world. Finally, in the middle, in the so-called realist category, there is Kane Kwei's coffin. It's hard to see this perhaps in such a small slide, but it's part of a tradition in Ghana of making coffins, sculpting coffins in a variety of delirious shapes, often very realist ones, such as this Pan Am airplane. To sum up then, I'm arguing that during the Cold War era, and I'm for, sort of convenience sake, defining this as from World War II to 1989, though we could argue vociferously about that particular categorization, but I'm just sort of taking the most standard one for argument's sake. During this period, the era of the three worlds, there are also three registers of images that on the one hand correspond geographically to those three worlds, as my introductory slide suggests, but in a way that correspondence is a sort of, does violence to the fact that each of these three registers also exist in each national or local art world. The modernist, the realist, whether socialist realism, folk realism, or capitalist realism, and the indigenous have tended to circulate in their own separate spheres, both internationally and nationally. And of course, it's almost always only work that passes a modern threshold, as it were, that gets to circulate globally. My proposition today is that the boundaries of these separate image spheres had begun to break down in a variety of dramatic ways by 1989, but this process had been happening throughout the 1980s, as indexed in several important exhibitions and art events that I'll briefly recount in a moment. I will call this interpenetration of the three visual image worlds, somewhat polemically, image deregulation, both because it signals a greater porousness between the three spheres I've posited, the modernist, the realist, and the indigenous, and also because it corresponds to a global economic dynamic during the 1980s, which is essential to any understanding of globalization. I'm speaking, of course, of the deregulation of markets, which obviously I would argue was accompanied by a kind of image deregulation. This deregulation of markets occurred under the tutelage of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which are two of the most important post-World War II finance entities meant to manage world economic health after the war. As Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph E. Stiglitz writes in his book Globalisation and Its Discontents, quote, "The most dramatic change in these international financial institutions, that is the IMF and the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, occurred in the 1980s, the era when Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher preached free market ideology in the United States and the United Kingdom. the IMF and the World Bank became the new missionary institutions through which these ideas were pushed on the reluctant poor countries that often badly needed their loans and grants. The ministries of finance in poor countries were willing to become converts if necessary to obtain the funds, though the vast majority of government officials, and more to the point, people in these countries, remained skeptical, unquote. One of the effects of financial deregulation on emerging markets was their invasion of formerly colonial powers in a neo-colonial, or what we now call neoliberal, gambit to place controls on local economies and thus influence national and regional politics. I believe that something analogous happens in the art world when it globalizes. We witness the installation of Western infrastructures or galleries and museums built by elites around the world. In short, economic liberalization and cultural modernization work hand in hand. The deregulation of image worlds, as I'm describing it, has had the effect of pluralizing the places of origin from which art can circulate globally. In other words, it's opened up the art world to art from many more places than the Euro-American centers had admitted before. So that's a good thing. In order to become global, though, I think a new kind of image world was required, and this is important, both inside the West and outside. And this new image world, I will argue, reorders the three registers that dominated the Cold War: the modernist, the realist, and the indigenous. This new global image world is produced from an accommodation or ratio, I'll argue, between heritage and debt, hence the title of my talk. The notion of heritage is somewhat self-evident. It refers to cultural genealogies of a particular location. What is new is that traditional or indigenous forms, sometimes very ancient ones, are folded into contemporary practice in order to singularize contemporary art production of a particular place. So there's reference to a long history, but that's the definition of contemporaneity. It's kind of a paradox. By debt, I mean to indicate a relation with modernism from outside one's time or place, what in pejorative terms in art contexts is often called derivative. And I really think that we need to take hold of this idea that art is derivative, and to think about what it means to say that there is a kind of origin for form, and then whatever comes after that origin is necessarily derivative. This historicizing relation is as present, as I mentioned a moment ago, in the traditional centers of modernism as it is beyond them. The prevalence of various forms of appropriation in the Euro-American art worlds of the 80s is an index of this condition. And here I'm showing you Sherry Levine's After Egon Schiele from 1982, where she rephotographs already made reproductions of the Expressionist painter's work. So in other words, I'm arguing that this fascination with the derivative and with heritage is worldwide, both in the West and outside, but the ratio between heritage and debt is singular and differs from place to place. Indeed, the financial analogy is once more relevant here. The IMF and the World Bank have been charged with putting controls and pressures on its client economies in the developing world through debt. As Maurizio Lazzarato contends in his brilliant and trenchant book, The Making of Indebted Man, quote, neoliberalism governs through multiple power relations: creditor-debtor, capital-labor, welfare programs user, consumer business, etc. But debt is a universal power relation, since everyone is included in it. Even those too poor to have access to credit must pay interest to creditors through the reimbursement of public debt. Even countries too poor for a welfare state must repay their debts, unquote. It is not merely metaphorical to say that global art today owes a debt to the international styles first invented in the West, predominantly, if not exclusively, the traditions of abstract painting and conceptual art. Image deregulation puts modernist, realist, and indigenous image worlds from all over the globe on the same playing field, but this also makes it possible to assert that such worlds marginal to the modernist canon own a debt to the West, in other words, that they're derivative. The introduction of heritage into the equation, I believe, in other words, the specificity of different regional experiences, heritage, is a way to mitigate, if not repay, this debt to a modernist tradition. Now, I know that's rather abstract, but let me introduce a range of examples which are quite canonical within the field of contemporary art, which show how this ratio between heritage and debt was played out around the year 1989. The first is a very famous exhibition that took place in Paris in 1989 called Magicien de la Terre, curated by Jean-Hubert Martin, which brought together artists working in all of the categories I've mentioned. But here what I'm showing you is the work, a land art work of the British artist Richard Long, and this earth painting of an Australian community of Aboriginals called Lamb Dreaming from 1989. So here what we have is a juxtaposition between a modernist version of art and an indigenous form. But they are compared to one another because their difference is negated by the fact that each is thought of as a magician. In other words, a shaman whose powers undo the debt to a Western tradition. Both Western artists and indigenous artists are magicians, and therefore they exist in a realm outside of the kinds of derivatives or debts that I've mentioned. So the first way of negotiating this ratio is through the enchanted individual. The second exhibition I want to mention is also a very famous example in recent years, and that is the Havana Biennial, which attempted to make an exhibition of South-South connections. In other words, a form of global art that did not take the West or the North as its point of reference, what was called the non-aligned nations after the famous Bandung Conference of 1955. Now, the curator, Gerardo Mosquera, recently reflected on the exhibition by saying, the subject of the whole event was tradition and the contemporary condition in third world art and design. So again, this idea of tradition and also the contemporary coming together. Here I'm showing you just one of many juxtapositions that occurred within the exhibition. Again, these are all large sprawling events that I'm just showing you as sort of signs of. But on the one hand, there's the conceptual Chilean artist Eugenio Ditborn, who made mail art, including forms, faces taken from police records, newspapers, and also these little doodlings, versus a bunch of wooden figures, indigenous figures, made of the liberator of Latin America from the 19th century, Simón Bolívar. In other words here, the bringing together of the indigenous and the modernist is done in order to create a collective solidarity that negates the primacy of the West. The third example I want to show comes from the China Avant-Garde exhibition in Beijing, which was a kind of culmination, as I mentioned already, of the New Wave generation of 1985. And here, again, is Xiao Lu's action of shooting her own work in the exhibition, which caused it to be closed down. Seen as part of the democracy movement, especially given its occurrence just before demonstrations in Tiananmen Square, I would like to think of this event as the calling in of a debt to be paid by, not to, the Western avant-garde. Here, the dynamic I've been discussing is reversed. The tradition of the avant-garde in the West, with its professions of political efficacy, with its promise of some kind of political effect, is here called in by the Chinese artists who have adopted or been inspired by its means belatedly. My next and final two examples indicate a different position, an effort to create a dividend from the ratio between heritage and debt. First is the example, just to summarize then, political demand is what reconciles the heritage debt opposition in the case of the China Avant-Garde exhibition. Here I'm showing you the Sotheby's auction from the Russian Avant-Garde and Soviet Contemporary Art Sale, which occurred on July 7th, 1988, and was widely seen as the opening of Russia to world markets in art before the Soviet Union fell. It was the auction occurred in Moscow, but you could only pay in pounds, and therefore British pounds. So it clearly was directed toward an outside audience. The New York Times reported the following statement from the Soviet official Sergei Popov about this auction, when it was criticized for being very capitalist in the context of the socialist or Marxist USSR government. So Sergei Popov, this official, says, "What is un-Marxist about selling works of art so that they might be better known all over the world? The better people outside know art and culture of our country, the greater the understanding of our country. That is very Marxist." So in this case, there is a way in which the market profile of a new Russia, which is still the Soviet Union, but it's about to be Russia, is promoted through the market. There's a kind of market profile which trades on the kind of heritage of Russian art and its debt to the West. My final example is similar, but of a more positive valence. This is actually a catalog cover, which you can't read the writing from that distance, but it is the 1990 Venice Biennale Pavilion for Australia, which included an indigenous artist and an artist of mixed heritage. The indigenous artist, Rover Thompson, making works that are derived from but modern versions of a kind of Aboriginal form of dream painting. And as many of you may know, this form of art became very popular and has a huge market as well. Here, like the USSR, Australia is seeking a dividend on the ratio between its heritages, one Aboriginal and one Anglo-Australian, and their debts to modern and indigenous genealogies. But instead of a financial dividend, what the Pavilion for Australia does is pay off in national identity. So let me summarize then the field described by ratio of heritage and debt. The enchanted individual, the magician of the earth, causes debt to be forgiven, because how can you charge a magician, right? A magician is outside normal economies. In terms of collective solidarity, the Havana Biennale, debt is refused. We refuse any debt to the West, any derivative. In terms of political demand, a debt is called in. Forms are taken seriously as avant-garde political tools, and the debt to the West is called in, is reversed and called in. In terms of market profile, and here I rely on my not very solid understanding of sophisticated finance. It is strange to think, when you're not in finance, that the notion of debt can be sold, but in fact that is precisely what happens today in the packaging and redistribution of debt that defines advanced financial commodities like securitization. So in the case of the Soviet auction or the Russian auction, the debt to the West is sold as a kind of entry into neoliberal economies. And with regard to the Aboriginal situation, it's sold for prestige as a multicultural modern nation that respects its indigenous traditions. I map out this field of positions in order to give a sense of the complexity and multidimensionality of the ratio between heritage and debt as art begins to globalize in earnest during the 1980s. By way of establishing a context for this reading, I want to first recall that the period I've been speaking of, the 1980s and early 1990s, was the period during which theories of postmodernism were dominant in the art worlds of New York and London and other Euro-American capitals. Frederick Jameson, the important cultural theorist, gave a different name to what I'm calling the ratio of heritage and debt. He called the Euro-American analog to this phenomenon pastiche, and here I'm showing you a work by one of the neo-expressionist American artists, Julian Schnabel, who was floating behind this definition of pastiche, who was taking up traditions of expressionism and figuration, which in many ways were considered regressive at that time. For Jameson, pastiche arises when it's no longer possible to experience history. In other words, for him, when history all becomes a set of commodified signs, like expression, just like broken dishes, which are what you see in the bottom of this, this painting, then there is no longer any capacity to understand anything as different. Pastiche is parody without any bitterness or viciousness in it. Pastiche is when everything is all circulating on the same even playing field. So for Jameson, pastiche marked the collapse of Euro-American modernism's historical project. What I'd like to suggest instead is that what Jameson called pastiche, we must understand as the ratio of heritage and debt. And here I'm showing you two artists who, both in 1993, Wang Guanyi and Alexander Kozolapov, both showing forms of capitalist realism, Coca-Cola, along with socialist realism, the worker and Lenin, respectively. In works like these, a negotiation takes place between socialist realism and capitalist realism. Contrary to Jameson, pastiche is only the quietest side, the kind of non-political side of an explosively politicized condition, which is the reconciliation of cultural debt and the claims for cultural legitimacy in a rapidly globalizing world. Thank you very much.